You know, I've been on the my longest interview process in my entire life. I think my longest before this was attempting to get a position with the Kansas Nonprofit Chamber, which took 3 months for the interview process. But this one's been going on for about 18 months, and it's getting a little exhausting. And I found myself having to travel very widely to areas like Kinsley. There's 17 counties in the 4th Congressional District. And when you're in Kinsley in the middle of July at a feedlot, you realize that you're working very, very, very hard for this interview process and this potential job. So it's been a real pleasure to actually get a chance to go out and meet so many people throughout the state. And so I'm thanking all of you for welcoming me here to speak today about foreign policy. My name is Perry Schuckman, and I am the candidate for the United States Congress from the 4th Congressional District in the year 2014. You know, American foreign policy occurs in many, many different ways. You know, there's examples that are sitting in this room of excellent American foreign policy. The Rotary Club, which has done outstanding work in working in trying to solve and to end polio throughout the world. And there's just a few little hot spots remaining in the world, and interestingly enough, those few hot spots are some of the places where our terrorists are most widely found, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so we need to find ways of trying to get within those communities, but the Rotary Club has done an outstanding job of really reaching out to the world and letting people understand that American citizens care. Another example that's in this room today is Reverend Sam Meiskens, who's a good friend of mine. Sam, just wave your hand. I'm not trying to. Sam has been working in Haiti for decades. I met Sam 12 years ago when I first moved to Wichita, Kansas, and I remember seeing the pictures all along the wall of all the work that his group and he have been doing to try to bring health care and education to the most impoverished country in the Western Hemisphere. And they've been doing just amazing work, and I really appreciate the work that American citizens do to reach out to the world to try to solve and let people know that Americans actually truly care. I can get my paper flipped here. You know, I'm going to share just a short anecdotal story before I get into my presentation. I had, in the last 8 months, I've had the opportunity to travel to both Russia, and then I also made a trip to Turkey. And in my trip to Russia, we were staying right downtown, the very heart of Moscow. And you know, I've been to the heart of Los Angeles, Chicago, San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and Wichita, Kansas. And it's very common for us to see panhandlers, people who are impoverished, who are looking for handouts. And so I kind of expected to see this when I was down in Moscow, you know, just in the middle of a city center like this. And we didn't really see this too much. And I thought it was very interesting. But there's one little anecdotal story that I want to share with you that I think is kind of humorous, and it certainly ties right back into, say, Fort Dodge in Kansas. And I was traveling with my cousin. She's the same age as me. Well, she's 2 weeks difference in age, but I won't give away who's the younger of the two of us. And we had gone down to the Kremlin, to the Red Square that afternoon, and watched a military parade. I always thought it'd be great to see a military parade on Red Square. You know, we remember all these things from our youth and seeing all the missiles. And in this particular case, it was a military marching band. And 26 nations in the world were represented in this parade. And it was really outstanding parade. And afterwards, we went out for dinner, and we also went to a bar, not very Moscowish, but we went we went to a bar called Coyote Uglies, and we had you've heard of Coyote Uglies? It's kind of a national franchise, and there was one right in Moscow, and we were partying with Boris Yeltsin, so we didn't have too many shots of vodka, but we had 2. And it was dark, and we were walking back to our hotel, which was just across the street from the Bolshoi Hotel. And I literally couldn't believe it, because I heard behind us, clip-clop, clip-clop, clip-clop. I'm not very good at making sounds, but clip-clop, clip-clop. And I stopped, and if I had been partying with Boris Yeltsin, I'd been worried that I was hallucinating. But I wasn't. And we looked behind us, and there was a horse. horse right downtown, middle of Moscow, and two young women, couldn't have been 20 years of age, and they walked, so we stopped, and they walked up to us, and they said that their horse was hungry, and they were begging for food, begging for money for the food for the horse. That was the most interesting. I've never seen something like that in my entire life anywhere in the world. So I thought I'd just share that little anecdotal story. You just never know what you're going to find any place in the world, whether it be the Fiji Islands or whether it be in Moscow, and the experiences that you might get. But my experiences with homeless shelters, and I've opened 5, and I've opened several charity medical clinics, was that I've never had a horse come up and ask me a neigh for food. So that was quite an interesting experience. But while I was in Moscow, I had a chance to meet with the nuclear officer, the American nuclear officer, who was based in the American embassy. Now, I don't know if all of you remember that we've rebuilt that American embassy several times. We built it once in 1976. We had rebuilt it in 1978-79 because we found that we were buying rebar from the Soviet Union, and they were putting microphone chips in the rebar. So we had to knock the entire embassy down. And I'm not quite sure why we would outsource such things such as this for an American embassy, but we'll talk about outsourcing in a moment when I talk about NASA as well. But she was expressing a concern about this bunker mentality and the Cold War that she was seeing coming on. And this is prior to the Ukrainian incident. And that there was this rift that was occurring between the United States and the President Putin. And she was concerned about this and was really trying to emphasize that we need to be careful not to let what might seem like momentary incidents become something like the Cold War again. I can't really agree more. Most of us in this room remember having to do the duck and cover under our desks, and how we don't want to let incidents, minor incidents, actually make our children or our grandchildren have to experience that again. The proliferation of nuclear weapons is growing in the world, but the two outstanding nuclear powers remains United States and Russia. And we cannot let ourselves, and I'm hoping that Russia feels the same way, get ourselves to where we're actually shaking the saber again. It just cannot happen. And I'll give you a couple examples of where we've actually, we hear all the time the bad news. Bad news, bad news, bad news. But one example of where President Putin has worked with the United States, and we need to continue reaching out to world leaders in this way, was to eliminate the gas that was being used in Syria in the Syrian civil war. Now, that may seem awkward to say for some people to even hear, but can you imagine what would be happening in this world today if ISIS had control or access to this gas? And not having the United States going in, but having France and Russia, France being the colonial power who created Syria, and Russia, who was funding and supplying their military, going in and removing this gas, was very, very important. And it kept the United States and our young folks out of that war. One other really important fact that we need to always keep in mind when we talk about a Cold War, I think that we have to eliminate evil. Evil in every way that's out there. And we see evil in ISIS, we see evil in Al-Qaeda, and we need to eliminate evil in every way possible. We cannot see, I don't want my children, to see grainy pictures of ISIL shooting any more men off of piers and pushing their bloody bodies into the water. I can't see that. However, we also have to keep in mind that over the last 40, 50 years, including Korea and Vietnam War, America lost 80, 90,000 men and women just by killed alone in the Cold War. And if we look at the same statistics for Russia, they lost 10,000 individuals. So we need to find a way of trying to keep a balance in what we think is the real battles and when we have to make a real fight. Going into Afghanistan was critical. And we need to also take a real strong look at Pakistan and protect ourselves against Pakistan. But we have to be able to be very, very sensitive to how we put our young folks into harm's way. And there's more than just more casualties than just occur because somebody's been killed. I worked with Vietnam veterans. Well, they weren't just Vietnam veterans, but I've worked with many veterans. And one particular program I worked with veterans, and these were all homeless veterans. And you know, we see the main bodies, we see the television commercials, and those are terribly important for people, Americans, to reach out and to help these maimed veterans. There's no question about that. And these are real true heroes. But we also don't see some of the other ramifications. And with the 50 homeless veterans that I worked with in one particular program, it was one of the very first projects I ever was involved with in a nonprofit world. We didn't succeed that well. The challenges were tremendous. You know, I hate to say that I failed. I was recognized by the Department of Labor program creativity, which is really terrific. But we had a massive problem in trying to get young folks, these veterans, out of the situation that they were in. And I'll just share you one anecdotal story, and it has nothing to do with the Christmas box that I shared with you a moment ago. That Christmas box story comes up in a moment. But I had a fellow, his name was Randy, and this was the very first year I was running a homeless shelter. And it was Christmas Eve, and you know, we gave out the t-shirts and the socks and the underwear, the kind of things you give out in a homeless shelter, kind of as complimentary Christmas gifts. And I was sticking around with the homeless shelter. I was running the program, but sticking around for the evening, and I sat down in a cot with a fellow named Randy, and Randy had probably one of the most severe drunks that I've ever known in my entire life, and he was very badly inebriated this evening as well. And I was sitting down with him on his cot, and he was talking about why he thinks he was such a bad alcoholic and why he's turned to this, and he was reflecting back on his time period as a member of the platoon in Vietnam, and he said, and I believe him because he went through our veterans program later on, that he had to shoot a young lady, a young girl, child, who was approaching his platoon, and they were concerned that maybe she had a bomb that she was carrying a bomb. There are ramifications to war that are tremendous. The ramifications to that young woman, whether she was carrying a bomb or not, I don't know. The ramifications to Randy, that will probably be lifelong for him, and ramifications for the 60,000 men and women that we physically lost, that were killed in Vietnam. And we need to find ways to always try to avoid those conflicts wherever possible. But we can't be a totally pacifist country either. We can't completely crawl within our borders and say that we have no purpose and no reason to protect American interests. And I will share a story with you, example of that, which is ISIL. And I guess I understand the President of the United States will be coming out with a presentation tomorrow, or a shared conference discussion with the American people about ISIL. And I am hoping that the United States Congress finds a way to work with the commander-in-chief versus battling and just sitting on the sidelines. And this is not a partisan issue. ISIL, as I mentioned a moment ago, was not just lining up hundreds of men and shooting them in the head on a pier, a bloody pier, and tossing them in the water, but they were having men standing in line in trenches. And it just reminds me of those grainy footages that we saw from World at War, where we saw all these victims of Nazi tyrannical Germany. And we cannot let those things happen again. And so we have to be able to address ISIL, and we have to be able to address it solidly. But it can't be just Americans doing this. You know, the threat is not just to the United States. The threat is to Malaysia, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Yemen. It's to all these other Arab countries out there that have, and Muslim, Islamic countries, that have a vested interest in sharing and showing to the world that they rail against brutality and stupidity and cruelty. And so it's really critical that we do those, that we keep a balance in what we think is important and where we're willing to put our American folks' lives on the line. A few minutes ago, we put together my video camera. And we had to kind of pull a NASA Apollo 13 moment in putting the video camera together. For some reason or another, the video camera didn't go together quite the way way it was supposed to go together. Is that right, Terry?
That's right.
And so I had to go out begging and finding some tape. It's not duct tape as was used in Apollo 13 to save those folks, but in order to put this camera together, we had to use some tape to put it together. In that same vein, I had the opportunity to meet with the NASA administrator when I was in Moscow at the embassy, and I had a chance to visit with the NASA administrator, and he explained to me that this was again before the Ukrainian crisis, that he was greatly concerned that the Americans' freedom to have a taxi ride via Russia to the International Space Station is always very, very vulnerable, and that we can't necessarily always be relying on outsourcing our capacity to explore space. And he gave me an example of why we're falling behind a little bit in terms of space exploration, of which I think space exploration is a critically important aspect, and it's an international aspect. But in June of 2014, Russia declared that it was no longer going to provide taxi rides to the International Space Station to the United States. We no longer have the space shuttle, not the publicly known NASA-owned space shuttles, that we can fly to the International Space Station. And part of that is because our spending on the NASA, and we're in the aerospace capital of the world, mind you, but the spending on NASA has gone from what was 5% at its very highest point to less than 0.2% of our total budget at the present. And it seems to me like this is something that, well, I have great fondness for astronomy myself, and I think that we need to continue always reaching for the stars. The saying for Kansas is ad astra, to the stars. It makes no sense that Kansas is not invested in putting our power and our energy and our resources into exploration. It's something that Americans, human beings, have always done, explore, as we've extended ourselves throughout the world. And now we have the opportunity to do the same thing throughout space. And we don't want to outsource and rely solely upon one particular entity for our access to the International Space Station or other places. So I would join with George Bush when he asked the American nation to commit itself to putting a man on the moon by the 2020, man on Mars by the year in the 2020s. But I would actually go one step further than that. My mother is probably my biggest advocate. She's since deceased, but she would say, I don't know why you wouldn't want to put a man on the moon. That should probably be a whoa man on the moon. And she would be very, very pronounced about doing that. But in the aerospace capital, we need to be very, very solid about taking a look at space exploration. And it's something that would bring good jobs to America, and it's certainly something that when I've had a chance to travel anywhere in the world, people think about the United States, they reflect upon our space exploration, and they think about our stepping onto the moon. And when they think about how we're doing that for all mankind, not for just the United States. And it's something that we have a chance to continue to be representative and a leader in as well. You know, there's real advantages that come out of space exploration. And one example is just this smartphone itself. This smartphone has more power, more computing power than the entire mission, first mission to the Apollo mission to the moon had. More computing power is in this one cell phone than the entire computing power of that first Apollo mission to land on the moon. We can grow technologically tremendously from our experiences in space if we continue to invest that way. So I wanted to share with you a couple examples about where I think we need to really be very, very conscious about in the world. One of the places that we need to be aware of is our footprint in terms of our military presence in the world. I would join with Senator Rand Paul in taking a look at limiting the Americans and crossing the aisle and working with another of the Republicans and trying to limit our footprint internationally in terms of our military presence. There's about 168 nations, and it changes sometimes, in the world, and we have military bases in almost 150 of those nations. There are places that we may not need to have military bases on. We've got dozens of military bases in Britain, in Italy, And these are countries that we should be expecting that they're actually participating in helping to quell extreme